One of the things that I've done as an educator is I've always tried to get better, and I find myself talking a lot to educators around the district in which I work, but also just in general when I meet and collaborate with others, either through Edmodo or other professional organizations, about this particular incident and some things that have happened in the course of the last 2.5 years for me as an educator. Because I can tell that I've become a much better educator in the last 2.5 years. Um, and part of it is really due to something that I see now. I always kind of knew this, but I never could put words to it. But once I was able to see what some research and some things and some experimental things were going on, now I can name what happened, and I can, kind of see how the narrative worked out and how this has implications for how we teach and what we're doing. Um, First context I want to point out then is this kind of is, I titled this Effective Use of Data and Feedback, a Retrospective. And it's based on a presentation that I saw at the 2011 National Model Schools Conference in Tennessee. Ray McNulty did a presentation on feedback. And it was a very lengthy presentation. It was very, very good. And it got me thinking about some things. And a couple of the things that he pointed out was actually, instead of just the use of academic data, we should also be using perceptual data, namely the data that students can give us, the feedback that we can get from them about our teaching. And he pointed out that, deep down, kids, if you really want to know how good or bad you are as a teacher, if they know that it's non-biased and there's no recourse for them speaking honestly, especially if it's critical, they'll tell you what you need to hear. And I had always as a teacher been practicing that. I always wanted kids to be honest with me, and even at the end of a course when the grades were already set, I wanted them to tell me, what they thought was good about my teaching, bad, what I needed to get better at, and the like. And then I can't recall if this was something that was in the presentation or not, but what it got me thinking about was focusing on this idea of the caring factor. And I believe that the caring factor basically is that if a kid feels as if the teacher cares about them, then that will directly translate into the likelihood of them being successful, both academically and achievement-wise, especially when it comes even to standardized testing and the like. And, so if you have a classroom of kids, let's say you had two different classrooms in the same high school, and both of them taught English 10 in Indiana. If you have a teacher in which it's apparent, or at least the kids feel as if they're not cared for, they're a lot less likely to do well on the state exam, the English 10 ECA, than if they're in a classroom where they have a teacher in which the kids feel as if they're cared for. Now notice how I frame that. It's not a matter of whether or not the teacher actually does or does not care. It's a matter of, do the students perceive that they are cared for, or that teacher cares for them? Because that's the most important thing. It's about what our emotions are and the cognitive idea of the students, not necessarily our motivations and what we think is going on. It's about how do they perceive reality rather than how we actually are, whether or not we care internally. So it's based upon like observable feedback, and that's why we talk about the caring factor. And that's what I believe it to be. So I actually went to that conference during summer school last year. I was teaching summer school at Northside High School, and I was teaching English 10, and I knew my students were going to have to take the English 10 end of course assessment. And what ended up happening was, in the course of those weeks, I started teaching, and then I had a sub for me for a couple of the days that I was in Tennessee for it. And when I came back, I still had like another week and a half to teach. And so I thought of doing something that was part of the presentation, and it was, have your students take an exit survey. And so what I did is I used surveymonkey.com or whatever the website is, and I set up a survey about some of the things listed in Ray McNulty's presentation on feedback and perceptual data. And what I found summer school last year was I had a couple of questions. One of the questions was, or one of the survey items was as follows. It said, Mr. Bailey cares about whether or not I passed the English 10 end of course assessment. And, then there were, strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. When I set these up too, I don't let them do neutral, or, you got to pick one. And the other item that I put up there was, Mr. Bailey cares about me as a person, and did strongly agree, all that stuff again. And what I found last year, and I can tell that from when I was teaching anyway, that the kids really enjoyed the class, and we did a lot of work together. We did a lot of projects. We did a lot of writing, and we practiced for the English 10 end of course assessment. But what was clear is that the achievement on the English 10 end of course assessment results that they had with me at the end of that were much, much either higher or they passed than compared to when they took it from their home schools, whether it was Northside or Snyder or wherever they came from. But their scores went way up even if they didn't pass it. And I think that it was directly related to that caring factor, that particular item that they said, like, strongly agree was what they picked when it came to caring about how they did and caring about them as people. So then that got me thinking about then this last school year, the 2011-2012 school year. A little bit of context here. The first year that I was at Northside High School for the 2010-2011 school year, we were under direct threat of state takeover because of how poorly we were doing on end of course assessments, English 10 being one of them, but also our algebra scores weren't very good. And so my first year we had to have a huge increase quickly, and so we did that because we brought in a lot of new staff, and we also changed the way in which we did things. And I was the lead English teacher, and I got a lot of feedback and good work from my teaching colleagues, and we were able to do some things that were somewhat outside of the box, but really in retrospect were ahead of the curve when it came to effective teaching, and I really enjoyed working with them. So we made a lot of progress quickly. Our scores jumped about 13% just in the first year. But now here's we make that big leap, and now here we are in the 2011-2012 school year. And throughout the course of this year, I'm not going to lie, this group of students that I had this year was significantly more difficult and hard for me to teach than the previous school year. There was a saying among us that, like, thank God that it was the previous year that we were on probation and not this one. That was the prevailing view of teachers. But this is where, one of the reasons why I'm doing this presentation is because sometimes what we perceive isn't exactly what's in reality. And, coming back to the academic data, my first and second period classes, when we did the tests at the beginning of the year, did poorly on reading comprehension and writing and those types of things. And, by the end of the year, they were doing a lot better, but even then, as a teacher, you go, that's not enough. The second thing is we had a group of students this year that had problems, legitimate problems that come from being in poverty and not having parents that cared about. In fact, a lot of the students that I had in one particular class period, I was the best thing that they had as far as a parent was concerned. And it was hard. It was a very difficult situation. And, among how hard we worked when it came to Northside High School English 10 classes this year, both myself and the other English 10 teacher, and then we teach in teams, the consensus was, man, these scores, I don't know if they're going to be that good. I don't know if we're even going to be able to match last year. What happened, though, is at the end of the year, and I'm going to pull this up. At the end of the year, actually, we took the English 10 end of course assessment during a particular week. At the end of that week, I set up a Google Documents form, and this is an example of one. And what I had the students do was fill out this perceptual data survey. So during the course of this school year, you were required to take quizzes, tests, and acuity assessments that were similar to the questions on the English 10 end of course assessment. Alright, so what am I testing there? I'm trying to figure out if what we did in the class helped them be successful on the test. Because really, like, they shouldn't be able to get an A in your class and then not pass the test, you know. So we're trying to make sure that there's that the test and also like what we're doing in class, you know, are synergistic, that they come together. During the course of this school year, you were taught how to use commas, semicolons, and other punctuation, etc. Which, by the way, there's those questions on the ECA and in the writing part. So I was making sure that what I had done in the course of the year prepared them for that part. During the course of this year, you were taught how to effectively answer constructive response questions, similar to those on the English 10. You know, we did acuity tests throughout the course of the year, in which we practiced writing constructive response, whether it was, you know, and we kind of showed them how they were scored throughout the course of the year. And then, prior to the exam and throughout the course of the year, Mr. Bailey explained how the test was scored. The readings, tests, and assignments in the class prepared me to take the English 10 end of course assessment. So we're making sure that there's not a disconnect between what was done in the class versus how well they would do on the test. Because of the essays and lessons in writing in Mr. Bailey's class, I was prepared to write the... So, once again, we're trying to make sure that what's happening in the class matches up with what's happening on the test, and not necessarily like because we're matching the class with the test, but because the students can see the connection between all the reading and writing tasks that we did in class versus the reading and writing tasks that were on the assessment. So now we jump to a different kind of sets of questions. Mr. Bailey cares about my success on the English 10 end of course assessment. Mr. Bailey cares about me as a person. As a result of this class, I've become a better reader. As a result of this class, I've become a better writer. So this is now the perceptual data about, well, these two questions are about whether or not they think I cared about them. Now whether or not I did or didn't is irrelevant. It's all about the perception of whether they did it. And then the last part was, I feel like I've become a better reader or a better writer. Now those are self-perception questions, but it's interesting to see, you know, what they've put. And then the last part is, you know, you can give them an opportunity to vent and tell you. So I always do this, and sometimes the feedback you get here is even greater and more specific than what you get in the survey questions. And I always like to do this. The last question is always a constructive response of some sort. So those are the types of questions that I asked. Now what I found then is, and these are just 3 of the 6 class periods that I taught, what I found is that the data from each of the questions came out almost exactly throughout the classes. And actually, if I show summary of responses, you know, strongly agree and agree. So they're saying my students believed that what we did in class prepared them for the test. Same thing with the next question. Strongly agree and agree. Constructed response. Strongly agree and agree. I explained how the test was scored. Now look, okay, so 2 of my students in that class period didn't get it. But I still think that the 16 and 12 frequency is more statistically significant. Reading tests and assignments prepared me to take this exam. Boom. Because of the essays and lesson in writing, you know, so once again, you see the same type of correlation taking place the whole way. Mr. Bailey cares about my success. Now, here's where that caring factor. 100% of the students, and this is across, like if I click on any of the other class periods, I have the exact same kind of distribution. 100% of my students believe that I cared about their success on the test. And look, and there's justifiable reason for this. Notice how they strongly agree about the end of course. So they have stronger feelings about my caring on the test. And even though they agree that I cared about them as a person, it wasn't as strong as it was on the test. And I can tell you that the reason that is the case is because, number one, the message of our school is that you will pass this exam, and that your teachers are going to be evaluated on how you pass that exam. The message of the school sometimes trumps the message of what's happening individually in the classroom. But not only that, I have to admit, I hammered it home that, you've got to pass this test, and how you do on it is going to affect me. And so the same thing was true with this then. But regardless of the strength of the feelings, the bottom line is 100% of the students felt like I cared about them as a person. And, I'd become a better reader. Now, this is one of those self-perception things. Some kids come in and they're already really good readers. They didn't need me. I helped them, and maybe they did improve, but they didn't perceive themselves as improving. Same thing is with the writing too. Is our students, a couple of them came in like super talented writers. And once again, is this reality? No, it's perception. But nonetheless, if they perceive that they have improved and gotten better, okay, that right there is going to translate directly into tangible, observable results on the standardized test. And if we are a results-driven district or a school, if we can control perception, that means we also can somehow control and enhance the outcomes that we're looking for. So those are some of the things. So going back then, what was crazy, I at the beginning of the discussion on Northside High School English 10, I talked about how difficult my students were. And I'm not going to lie, when we went and took the test and then took that survey, and I got all this feedback about, and even then some of the kids got done with the test, they're like, this test was so easy, our acuity tests were harder, or the tests you made us do were harder, and blah 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 blah. I was scared because it was one of two scenarios. Number one, the scenario that could be the case is that the English 10 end of course assessment was so out of their league that they perceived themselves as being successful even when they weren't. And we had seen results like that in the PSAT and the SAT and things at the different schools that I've been at, where the kids were like, oh, that was easy, and then you go and look at the scores and the scores are completely low. It was easy because they filled out bubbles quickly. But the second scenario, which was reality for what it was that indeed the test was easier than I thought it was going to be for them, and that they really did achieve. And here I mentioned that, like, okay, I thought going into that test that approximately 62% of my students had a very, very good shot of passing the ECA. I had a lot of special ed kids. I had a lot of kids whose home life doesn't reinforce or reinvigorate reading and writing or even doing homework. I had a lot of kids who've been arrested, in jail, problems with poverty, living in a safe environment, those types of things. And so I thought with fidelity, with the data that I had in front of me, that only about 63% of my students were going to pass it. But what happened was, when the data came back from the state, 72% of my students passed it. And that, especially given the high frequency of poverty among my students and the number of, poor minorities and, all kinds of data in which, that normally struggle in public schools, surprised the heck out of me. And our school goal overall was a 70% pass rate. And for us to beat the school goal, given the brand of kid that I had this year, was a thrilling achievement, and I was so proud of my kids because they surpassed the expectations. But now I go back, and I think that it happened because of that care factor. And I can also say, too, that the 2 freshman English teachers that these kids had the previous year would have rated very high on the care factor. And I think having that continuous, my teachers care about me mentality has helped our students achieve at high levels at Northside High School. And that brought up some things then in retrospect that I think are very important and can greatly help wherever you are as a teacher, especially in an urban school. I used Edmodo for basically the last third of the school year. And what Edmodo allowed me to do was to engage in more project-based learning. But what it also forced our students to do was it forced them to read directions. And it forced them to read a variety of texts. And it also, in a lot of different media, not just text, but also pictures and art and music and things. Edmodo allowed that to happen. But one of the things that Edmodo also allows you to do as a teacher is to take polls of your students. And it allows voice and choice in what I had to teach next. A lot of times I would post, Mr. Bailey's thinking about doing the 3 following things. Which one do you think is most important? And based upon that survey data, then that would allow me to then, pick what I was going to actually teach to the whole group at that moment in time, and then what could be put to the back burner. So Edmodo was an absolutely great tool for me to get perceptual data and to drive further instruction. And also to do highly effective instructional strategies and use project-based learning. And then summer school, I taught English 12 for summer school, and this was my last teaching gig, but I did the exact same thing. We're having that exit survey in place about, the stuff that they learned. Did they feel like they actually learned it? And then, that caring factor. The exact same results in this summer school for English 12 were the same results for the English 10 classes, the same results for summer school last year. And I think that one of the greatest things that we ought to do as teachers, it would be a good idea, is to start doing exit surveys and entrance surveys, for that matter, on strengths and weaknesses of the students. How do they feel about doing certain things and about certain topics and ideas, and then having exit surveys about what did they learn, and can they name it, and also how we are as teachers, getting feedback as teachers on how to improve from our kids. An awful lot of time that they speak honestly, and they give you some ideas that you would never had if you weren't listening to them. And so those are the reflections and implications. We got to have the caring factor in there, and we need to have perceptual data. We need to have a place to gather that, because perception oftentimes is reality, and it leads to measurable outcomes for students. So that is my presentation, and I want to thank Ray McNulty for having done that, because he also encouraged people. They go, not a lot has been done in this, and it's scary to think that like a governor or politicians would come up with such and such a thing to do, because we need teachers to go out there and play with this and tinker with it. And so I came back and I did it. We need more, though, than just me. So that is my presentation on effective use of data and feedback, or retrospective. I think gathering that data and listening to the kids has ultimately changed the way in which I've done business for the better, and can greatly impact the effectiveness of a school and how they do